I was sitting in that cold, windowless room, with 3 men in gray suits staring at me from the other side of the cheap wooden table. The manila envelope was right there, right in front of me, too thick to be just papers. My heart was beating so hard I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. One of the elders, Brother Carmichael, slid the envelope toward me with that smile I had seen 1,000 times during the 27 years I spent inside the Kingdom Hall. It was the same smile he wore when greeting the sisters on Sunday mornings, but now there was something different in those faded blue eyes. There was fear. $100,000. That was the amount they were willing to pay for me to sign that non-disclosure agreement and vanish from the city of Portland, Oregon, where I had built my entire adult life. $100,000 for me to forget what I had seen, what I had discovered, and mostly, for me to stop asking questions. They wanted me to disappear as if I had never existed, as if the last 27 years were just a nightmare from which I was finally waking up. But I couldn't accept that money. Not when I knew there were other women going through the same hell I went through. Not when I knew there were children being silenced, families being destroyed, and lives being ruined while those men in gray suits continued smiling from their pulpits every Sunday. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, I am 52 years old, and for nearly 3 decades I believed I was serving God. Today I know I was serving an organization that protects predators and punishes victims. And this is my story. I pushed the envelope back to Brother Carmichael, stood up from the chair with my legs shaking, and said the only words that mattered in that moment, I'm going to tell everything. Before I dive into the darker details of this journey, I need you to understand one thing. I am not here to attack anyone's faith or to tell you what you should or shouldn't believe. I am here because for 27 years I lived inside a system that taught me to distrust the outside world, to avoid deep relationships with anyone who wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, and above all, to never, ever question the elders or the organization. I was a regular pioneer for 15 years, knocking from door to door under the scorching summer sun and the biting winter cold in Portland, distributing the Watchtower and Awake magazines, and devoutly believing I was saving lives. My story is not unique. There are thousands of women and men around the world who have gone through or are going through exactly what I went through. The difference is that many of them are still trapped in silence, suffocated by the fear of losing their families, their friends, the entire social structure they know. Because that's how it works. When you join Jehovah's Witnesses, especially if you are born into the organization, your whole world becomes that Kingdom Hall, those meetings 3 times a week, those summer conventions where you spend entire days listening to talks about how the end of the world is near and only the faithful will be saved. But this story needs to be told. Every detail, every moment of pain, every devastating discovery. And I need you to stay with me until the end, because only then will you understand why I refused that money. Only then will you understand the real price of truth. If you are watching this video right now, please leave a like so that more people can know this story. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because stories like this need to be heard. And tell me in the comments which city you are watching from. I want to know where the people are who also seek the truth, who aren't afraid to face reality, no matter how painful it is. Now take a deep breath with me, because what comes next isn't easy to hear. But it is necessary. It is urgent. And most importantly, it is real. I was 25 years old when I was baptized in the freezing waters of that pool set up in the convention stadium in Seattle. It was July of 1998, and I remember feeling that finally my life had a real purpose. I had grown up in a dysfunctional family in Tacoma, Washington, with an alcoholic father who disappeared for weeks and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep the house running. When Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on my door for the first time, I had just lost my job as a secretary at a law firm and was completely lost. Those 2 smiling women, Sister Carol and Sister Judith, seemed to have all the answers I was looking for. They spoke about a paradise on earth, about how God had a plan for each of us, about how the suffering of this world was temporary. I started studying the Bible with them twice a week. The meetings at the Kingdom Hall became the center of my life. I stopped going out with my old friends because they were part of the world, and the organization made it very clear that friendships with worldly people were dangerous to our spirituality. I stopped celebrating my birthday, stopped exchanging gifts at Christmas, stopped participating in any celebration the organization considered of pagan origin. And I did all this wholeheartedly, believing I was pleasing God. My mother was devastated when I said I wouldn't visit the family for Thanksgiving anymore, but I had been taught that my loyalty was now to Jehovah and his organization, not to worldly blood ties. It was at a Bible study that I met David. He was 2 years older than me, had been baptized since he was 15, and worked as a plumber. The elders encouraged dating only between baptized brothers and sisters, always with a chaperone present to ensure there was no immorality. David was kind, dedicated to the meetings, commented regularly at the midweek meetings. His parents were special pioneers, those who dedicated more than 100 hours a month to the field service. In the eyes of the congregation, he was the perfect choice. We got married 6 months later, in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall, without a champagne toast because excessive alcohol was discouraged, without secular music because we had to keep ourselves separate from the world. The first few years were good, or at least that's what I convinced myself. David worked a lot, and I had become a regular pioneer, dedicating 70 hours a month knocking on doors, standing at witnessing carts in downtown Portland, holding those magazines even when people ignored me or slammed the door in my face. The organization taught that every rejection was proof of our faithfulness, that we were being persecuted just as Jesus was persecuted. I felt special, chosen, part of a select group that had the knowledge of the truth while the rest of the world lived in darkness. At the Thursday night meetings, I listened to talks about the signs of the last days, about how the Great Tribulation was near, about how we needed to remain vigilant and pure. But there was something that bothered me from the start, something I tried to push to the back of my mind every time it came up. Women in the organization could not hold positions of authority. We couldn't give talks on the main stage, we couldn't be elders, we couldn't even pass the microphones during meetings. When I questioned this once with Sister Carol, she told me this was the order established by God, that the man was the head just as Christ was the head of the congregation. I swallowed that explanation because I was still learning, still molding myself to that new life. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, even if I didn't know it yet. I saw intelligent, articulate women, deeply knowledgeable of the scriptures, being limited to doing only stage demonstrations in the second school, while men who could barely form coherent sentences gave talks on the main stage simply because they were born with the right equipment between their legs. David began to change after 3 years of marriage. The kindnesses disappeared gradually. He started coming home late, smelling of beer, even knowing that drunkenness was grounds for disfellowshipping. When I tried to talk, he reminded me that according to the scriptures, I should be submissive, that he was the head of the house. I went to speak with Brother Carmichael, who at the time was just a ministerial servant, not yet appointed an elder. He listened to me for 5 minutes and then told me that I needed to be a better wife, more loving, more submissive. That maybe if I were more attractive to my husband, he wouldn't need to seek comfort elsewhere. I left that meeting feeling dirty, guilty, as if David's behavior was my fault. And that was exactly what the organization wanted me to feel. It was on a rainy Tuesday in October when my life began to crumble for real. I had gone to the Kingdom Hall early to help clean before the service meeting, as I always did. The place was practically empty, just Brother Jenkins, an elder in his 60s, organizing papers in the back office. I was vacuuming the main auditorium when I heard raised voices coming from that small room. It wasn't my intention to eavesdrop, but the words were so charged with emotion that I couldn't help but pay attention. It was a young woman's voice, Sister Rebecca, a 19-year-old girl I had known since she was 12. Her voice was trembling, broken, desperate. She was telling Brother Jenkins that she had been molested by her stepfather, who was also a Jehovah's Witness, since she was 13. She had finally gathered the courage to report it, to seek help, to make it stop. I froze with the vacuum still running in my hand, unable to move, unable to process what I was hearing. Brother Jenkins' response was what destroyed me. He asked if there were 2 witnesses to the abuse. Rebecca sobbed that no, it happened when they were alone, that her stepfather threatened her saying no one would believe her. Brother Jenkins then explained, with that calm and pastoral voice I had heard so many times from the pulpit, that without 2 witnesses, he couldn't do anything. That accusing a brother without sufficient evidence would be slander. I turned off the vacuum and stood there, holding that plastic handle as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. Rebecca came out of that room with swollen eyes, passed by me without really seeing me, as if she were walking in a trance. I wanted to run after her, hug her, say that I believed her, but my feet were glued to the floor. Because I had also been taught about the two-witness rule. It was there in the book that guided the elders, that secret manual that only they could read, based on a scripture in Deuteronomy about not accepting the accusation of a single witness. But how can there be two witnesses to abuse that happens in the dark, in silence, in shame? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing in bed next to David, who snored peacefully after coming home drunk yet again, thinking about that girl. Thinking about how many other girls, how many other women, had gone through the same situation. The next day I went to Rebecca's house. She lived in a tiny apartment near the Gresham division, paying rent with a waitress salary that barely covered the bills. When she opened the door and saw me, her eyes filled with tears again. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. She told me details that made me want to vomit, made me want to take my car and drive to that monster's house and take justice into my own hands. Her stepfather was a respected ministerial servant in the congregation. He gave public talks, conducted Bible studies, was seen as an example of dedication. Rebecca's mother didn't want to believe her daughter's accusations because that would mean she had failed to protect her, mean she had brought a predator into the house. And the organization not only allowed this silence, it encouraged it. Rebecca told me she had thought about going to the police, but the elders had made it clear that involving worldly authorities would bring reproach upon Jehovah's name. That internal problems should be solved internally. That she needed to wait on Jehovah, pray more, strengthen her faith. I left that conversation transformed. For the first time in 10 years of total dedication to Jehovah's Witnesses, I questioned if that really was the truth. Because the God I believed I served would not protect an abuser at the expense of a child. The God I knew in the pages of the Bible defended the weak, the oppressed, those who had no voice. But the organization that claimed to represent this God was doing exactly the opposite. I started paying attention to things that previously went unnoticed. The families that disappeared from the congregation overnight and no one explained why. The sisters who wore sunglasses even on cloudy days. The young people who left for the world and were treated as if they had died, their names never mentioned again, their empty chairs in the kingdom halls like black holes sucking out all the joy. I started asking questions. Discreetly at first, then more openly. I asked Brother Carmichael, who is now the coordinator of the body of elders, about the two-witness policy. He told me I was questioning Jehovah's wisdom, that the organization knew what it was doing, that I needed to trust the faithful and discreet slave, that group of men in New York who supposedly received divine direction. I asked why there were so many cases of abuse being discovered in congregations around the world, why the organization was paying millions in settlements if it had nothing to hide. Carmichael warned me that I was being influenced by apostates, by lies spread by bitter people who had left the truth. But I couldn't close my eyes anymore. I had seen the real pain on Rebecca's face. I had heard the despair in her voice. And I knew, deep in my heart, that this couldn't be right. This couldn't be the will of a loving God. I started researching in secret, using the computer at the public library because I knew David monitored the history of our home computer. I found hundreds of documented cases. I found lawsuits. I found recordings of judicial committees where women were interrogated about intimate details of the abuse they suffered. I found the secret database the organization kept with more than 20,000 cases of known abusers, information that was never reported to the authorities. And that was when I realized I had to make a choice. I could keep pretending I knew nothing, keep smiling on Sundays, keep distributing those magazines that promised a paradise that might never come. Or I could act. I could use my voice, even knowing it would cost everything I knew. Even knowing I would be labeled an apostate, that I would lose my marriage, my community, possibly even my family. The choice should have been impossible, but in truth, it was the easiest thing I ever did. Because I couldn't look at Rebecca and all the others like her and stay silent anymore. David discovered my research on a Thursday night. I had been careless, had left some notes in my coat pocket, papers with names of victims, dates of court cases, lawsuit numbers. He came home earlier than usual and found those papers on the kitchen table where I had left them while making dinner. The explosion was instant and terrifying. He screamed that I was an apostate, that I was being deceived by Satan, that I was destroying our family and our salvation. He took those papers and tore them into tiny pieces, throwing everything in the trash as if they were toxic waste contaminating our home. But the worst wasn't his anger. It was what came after. David called Brother Carmichael that same night, and the next morning I was being summoned for a meeting with the elders. 3 men waited for me in that windowless room, seated behind that table as if they were judges of the Supreme Court. Carmichael was in the middle, flanked by Brother Jenkins and Brother Marshall, a man in his 40s with a gray mustache who always gave me the creeps. They started with soft, almost fatherly questions, asking if I was facing spiritual difficulties, if I needed help to strengthen my faith. I could have lied. I could have said I was going through a moment of weakness, that I repented, that I would go back to being the dedicated pioneer I always was. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was the raw and painful truth. I told them about Rebecca. I told them about the research I did. I told them about the thousands of documented cases of abuse within the organization. I told them I could no longer preach from door to door offering hope when I knew children were being silenced inside the very kingdom halls. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. The 3 men looked at me as if I had blasphemed, as if I had spit in the face of God. Carmichael was the first to speak. He said I was spreading slander against Jehovah's organization. That I was being influenced by information from apostates, that I couldn't trust anything I found on the internet or in the secular media. That the organization handled these cases appropriately, following biblical principles, and that it was not my place to question the wisdom of the governing body. Jenkins added that my attitude was causing division in the congregation, that other sisters were commenting on my inconvenient questions, that I was being a stumbling block. Marshall simply stared at me with those cold eyes, writing down every word I said in a black notebook. They gave me a week to repent. 1 week to stop the questions, burn all my notes, and return to being submissive to the organization. If I didn't do this, a judicial committee would be formed and I could be disfellowshipped. And they made it very clear what that would mean. No Jehovah's Witness could speak to me, not even greet me. My family inside the organization would have to treat me as if I were dead. David would likely divorce me, and under the rules, he would be permitted to remarry because I would have become an apostate. I would lose literally everything and everyone I knew. That week was the longest of my life. I could barely eat, barely sleep. David had moved into the guest room and treated me with silent contempt. I had no one to talk to because all my friendships were inside the congregation. My mother had died 2 years prior from pancreatic cancer, and I had cut contact with all my worldly relatives years ago. I was completely alone, exactly as the organization planned for anyone who dared to question to be. But it was in this solitude that I found clarity. I realized that a faith that depended on keeping me ignorant wasn't real faith, it was control. I realized that an organization that prioritized its reputation over the safety of children didn't deserve my loyalty. I realized that true love doesn't come with conditions, doesn't abandon you for asking hard questions, doesn't punish you for defending victims. And mostly, I realized I preferred to lose everything than continue being complicit in a system that caused so much suffering. On the 7th day, I went back to that room. The same 3 men, the same table, the same suffocating atmosphere. Carmichael asked if I had repented. I looked him in the eyes and said no. I said I repented for staying silent for so long, for ignoring the signs, for having been part of that system. But that I did not repent for defending victims, for seeking the truth, for choosing my conscience over blind obedience. They didn't even need to deliberate much. 15 minutes later, they came back with the verdict. I was being disfellowshipped for apostasy. The announcement was made at the next meeting, on a Thursday night. I wasn't there to hear it, but Rebecca told me later. Carmichael went up on stage and said the words I knew would come. Eleanor Whitmore is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. No explanation, no detail, just that sentence that transformed a person into a ghost. The people who had been my friends for a decade looked away. The brothers and sisters with whom I had spent countless hours in the field service, at meetings, at conventions, simply erased my existence. David filed for divorce the following week. He kept the house because it was in his name, he kept the better car, he kept everything. I moved into a tiny apartment in Beaverton with just 2 suitcases of clothes and a box of books. I was 48 years old, unemployed because I had dedicated the last 15 years to pioneering instead of building a career, and I knew absolutely no one outside the organization. It should have been the end of my story. It should have been the moment where I completely fell apart. But it was the opposite. It was the moment where I finally started to live for real. I got a job as a receptionist at a veterinary clinic. The pay was terrible, barely paid the rent and basic bills, but it was a start. My coworker, Sarah, noticed I seemed lost, displaced, like someone learning to walk after years in a wheelchair. She invited me for coffee after work, and for the first time in years, I accepted making friends with a worldly person without feeling guilty. Sarah was kind, funny, had a loving family, and knew absolutely nothing about Jehovah's Witnesses. To her, religion was something personal, not a controlling organization that dictated every aspect of your life. It was Sarah who suggested I look for other people who had left Jehovah's Witnesses. She found online support groups, forums where ex-members shared their stories. I hesitated at first because I still had that voice in my head telling me that apostates were bad, bitter people, controlled by demons. But I finally gathered the courage and attended an in-person meeting at a cafe in Northeast Portland. There were 12 people in that room, of varying ages, different backgrounds, but all with the same pain in their eyes. The same pain of having lost entire families, decades-long friendships, a whole life structure for daring to think differently. It was there that I met other abuse victims. Women who had gone through the same thing as Rebecca, who had been silenced by the 2-witness rule, who had been blamed by the elders. Men who had been abused as children and never received justice because the abuser was a respected elder. Young people who had left the organization at 18 and never spoke to their parents again. The pattern was frighteningly consistent. It wasn't just a few isolated cases. It was systemic. It was how the organization operated, and had operated for decades. I started participating in a podcast run by a former elder named Marcus, who documented cases of abuse and misconduct within Jehovah's Witnesses. Marcus had access to internal documents, recordings of judicial committees, victim testimonies. He invited me to share my story on the podcast, and after much hesitation, I accepted. The episode aired on a Tuesday in March. I used my real name, told about Rebecca, about the meeting with the elders, about everything. I expected maybe a few hundred people to listen. In 24 hours, it had over 50,000 downloads. Messages started arriving from all over the world. Australia, UK, Mexico, Brazil, Japan. People saying they had lived identical situations. Parents who had lost children to suicide after being disfellowshipped. Women who were still trapped in abusive marriages because divorce without biblical grounds would mean losing everything. Children who grew up without celebrating birthdays, without making friends at school, without having a normal childhood. Every message was a knife to the heart and at the same time a confirmation that I had made the right choice. The organization noticed. 2 weeks after the podcast, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a lawyer representing the branch of Jehovah's Witnesses in the United States. He said I was spreading false information that slandered the organization, that I could be sued for defamation. I hung up on him. The next day, another lawyer called. This one had a different tone. Friendlier, almost sympathetic. Said he understood I had gone through difficulties, that sometimes people leave the organization with grievances and don't see things clearly. Said the organization would like to resolve this amicably. That was when they mentioned the meeting. They said some representatives from the branch would like to talk to me in person, hear my concerns, maybe find a way for everyone to move on. I knew it was a trap, but my curiosity was greater than my common sense. I agreed to meet them at a law firm in downtown Portland. When I arrived, there were no lawyers. Just 3 elders I had never seen before, clearly sent by the branch. And Brother Carmichael, who looked at me as if I were dirt stuck to his shoe. They started with veiled threats. Spoke about how my public statements were causing legal problems for local congregations, how families were being affected, how I was preventing people from knowing the truth. I listened in silence, my fists clenched under the table. When they finished, one of the branch elders, a balding man of about 60 in a very expensive suit, slid a manila envelope toward me. He said the organization was prepared to make a generous offer to resolve this unpleasant situation. Inside the envelope was a non-disclosure agreement and a check. The agreement said I could never again speak publicly about my experience in Jehovah's Witnesses, never again participate in podcasts or interviews, never again publish anything related to the organization on social media or any other platform. I would have to remove all comments and appearances I had already made. I would have to disappear from activism, vanish from support groups, erase my voice as if it had never existed. In exchange, they offered me $100,000 and a letter of recommendation that would help me get a better job. They even suggested I could move to another city, start a new life, forget all this as if it were just a bad chapter that was finally over. I looked at that check and for a second, just a second, I considered accepting. $100,000 meant financial security I hadn't had in years. It meant being able to pay for a decent apartment, maybe take a course, rebuild my life without the constant worry of how I would pay the bills at the end of the month. It meant peace, or at least the illusion of it. But then I thought of Rebecca. I thought of those messages I received from all over the world. I thought of the women who were still trapped, the children who were still being silenced, the families that were still being destroyed while the organization continued operating the same way, protecting its image instead of protecting the vulnerable. Carmichael must have seen the hesitation on my face because he leaned forward, that pastoral smile back on his lips. He said I looked tired, that it was time to leave the past behind, that I deserved to move on. Said my crusade wasn't changing anything, that the organization had millions of members around the world and my lonely little voice was just an annoying mosquito that would be forgotten in a few weeks. Said I was wasting the best years of my life fighting against something much bigger than me, when I could be building a real, stable, peaceful future. And it was in that moment that I understood what that money really represented. It wasn't generosity. It was fear. They were afraid because they knew that every voice that rose up inspired others to do the same. They knew that every shared story created cracks in the perfect facade they worked so hard to maintain. They knew the internet had changed the game, that they could no longer control information the way they controlled it when everything was done through printed publications and closed meetings. That's why they were willing to pay 6 figures to shut up a 52-year-old ex-pioneer who worked at a veterinary clinic. I took the check and the non-disclosure agreement and tore them very slowly, very deliberately, letting the pieces fall onto that polished table. The balding elder turned red, the veins in his neck bulging. Carmichael turned so pale I thought he might faint. I stood up from the chair, leaned both hands on the table, and looked each of them in the eye. I said they could keep their dirty money, that I wasn't for sale, that my conscience was worth more than any amount they could offer. I said that as long as I had breath in my body, I would keep telling the truth, keep defending the victims, keep exposing the rotten system they helped perpetuate. Before leaving that room, I turned to Carmichael and said something that had been stuck in my throat for years. I said he knew I was right. That deep down, in the quiet moments of the night when he was alone with his thoughts, he knew the 2-witness rule was absurd, that protecting abusers in the name of the organization's reputation was monstrous, that destroying families because someone asked hard questions wasn't Christian love. I said he would have to live with that conscience, with all the suffering he helped cause, with all the victims he could have helped but chose to abandon. And then I walked out of there with my head held high, leaving those men in gray suits sitting in silence. When I got to the parking lot, my legs finally gave way. I sat on the cold concrete ground and cried like I hadn't cried in months. I didn't cry from sadness or regret. I cried from relief. Because finally, after years of feeling small and powerless, I had done something that mattered. I had chosen the right side. I had proved to myself that I wasn't a coward, that I couldn't be bought, that my integrity had no price. Sitting in that parking lot, with the autumn sun warming my face and tears running down my chin, I felt freer than I had ever felt inside the Kingdom Hall. Sarah was waiting for me at a nearby cafe, where I had asked her to stay in case I needed help. When I told her what had happened, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She said I was the bravest person she knew, but I didn't feel brave. I just felt that I had done what any decent person would do. The problem is that inside that organization, doing what was decent often meant going against everything you had learned, everything you had built, everyone you loved. That night, I posted about the offer on social media. I told that the organization had tried to buy me and that I had refused. The post went viral. Journalists started contacting me. News channels wanted interviews. Suddenly, my story wasn't just mine anymore. It was part of something much bigger, a growing movement of ex-members who were refusing to stay silent, who were supporting each other, who were using their voices to create the change the organization refused to implement. Rebecca called me crying after seeing my post. She said she had finally gathered the courage to go to the police and file a police report against her stepfather. Said that seeing me refuse that money had shown her it was possible to choose what was right even when it cost everything. Her case probably wouldn't result in anything because too much time had passed, but she said she needed to do that for herself, for her own healing. And knowing she wasn't alone, that there were people who believed her, had made all the difference. In the following months, 3 more women from my old congregation left and shared their own stories of abuse and cover-ups. The congregation went into crisis, with entire families questioning what was happening. Carmichael was removed as coordinator of the body of elders, not because he had done something wrong in the eyes of the organization, but because he had lost control of the congregation. And I learned from inside sources that the branch was in a panic, trying to contain what they called an apostate rebellion, but which was actually just people finally finding the courage to speak the truth. Today, for years after that meeting, I work as a coordinator for a support center for ex-members of high-control religious groups. It's not a job that pays well, but it's the most meaningful work I've ever done in my life. I help people who are leaving, who have lost everything, who don't know how to rebuild their lives from scratch. I offer the support I myself desperately needed and could barely find. I create connections between abuse victims and lawyers who work pro bono. I assist families who are trying to maintain contact with loved ones still inside the organization. And every day, every single day, I receive messages from people thanking me for refusing that money, for continuing to speak, for proving that one voice can make a difference. I won't lie and say it was easy. There are days when loneliness hits hard, days when I miss the community I had, the comfortable certainty of knowing exactly what to believe and how to live. There are days when I see old photos of conventions, of missionary trips, of moments that at the time seemed so pure and meaningful, and I feel a pang of nostalgia. My younger brother, who is still inside the organization, hasn't spoken to me in 3 years. My niece, whom I helped raise, treats me as if I were invisible when we run into each other by chance at the grocery store. That hurts in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has never been through it. It's like mourning people who are still alive, but who have been taught that you are dead to them. But when I put everything on the scale, when I weigh what I lost against what I gained, I have no doubt that I made the right choice. Because now I sleep at night knowing I am not complicit in a system that hurts people. I wake up in the morning knowing my voice matters, that my choices are mine, that no one controls my thinking or my conscience. I have true friendships based on real affinity, not religious obligation. I have the freedom to question, to doubt, to change my mind without fear of punishment. And mostly, I have the peace of knowing that when offered $100,000 to stay silent, I chose my integrity. That is something no amount of money could buy. This is my story, and I refuse to stay silent so that you and thousands of other people could hear it.